Ikeda Daisaku is a, putting it mildly, rather controversial figure in the history of Japanese life and politics. Coming initially from a family well known for their edible seaweed, he eventually found his way into Nichiren Buddhist teachings in the post-World War II era, primarily through joining the Soka Gakkai organization. After climbing through the ranks over the course of the ensuing years, he became the group's president in 1960 and spearheaded international campaigns for Soka Gakkai. Although he stepped down from the position at the end of the 70s, he was still regarded as the group's single most important figure, having more public and rhetorical staying power than pretty much anyone else in the group's history. Among his output of work includes a series of children's stories, as well as a dubious biography called The Human Revolution, or Ningen Kakume. Such was his popularity that various writers and portions of the Japanese public regarded and still regard Soka Gakkai as a cult, in part because of its aggressive manner of recruiting and keeping members, the active involvement of such an overtly religious group in the political sphere, and the flagrant idolization of Ikeda. This is also in addition to controversies and skepticism surrounding the Japanese New Religions movement, or Shinshukyo, at large, but I'm not going to delve into that long and thorny history for the purposes of this video. Despite its open calls for peaceful efforts, often outlined in a series of reports made annually to the United Nations starting in 1983, controversies continued to follow both Ikeda and Soka Gakkai. Ikeda ultimately passed away in 2023 at the age of 95. So anyway, did you know that there are a bunch of anime based on his published work? Through the course of the 1980s and into the 2000s, a series of rather brief OVAs, movies, and one longer-form series were released, often either created or produced by Shinano art and culture consultant and Studio Toei. As for what these stories are about, I'll just let the kid who clearly is trying their absolute best answer that question for me.
His stories are about universal values such as the preciousness of life and the importance of compassion and courage.
Well, I don't know about you, but with such a thunderous introduction, there is a simple question to be asked. Are these stories, in fact, good? Probably not, but anime is nothing but a rather unusual medium, and I don't like the idea of something existing and me not seeing it. So, let's run the gauntlet. This is every Ikeda Daisaku anime. I did realize as I was writing this script that this is actually the second time that I've covered anime content that originally came from a, shall we say, highly questionable religious leader. The first being the initial installment of Finding Kyoto Animation with Okawa Ryuho and Shiawase Nani. It just so happens that I have also watched the absolutely weird and astronomically boring Aum Shinrikyo anime as well. Whether you want to say that this information is somehow indicative of something wrong with me psychologically, I'll let the YouTube comment section and its all-knowing wisdom take care of that. Anyway, since I'm covering so many of these, I'm not going to get nearly as in-depth as I ordinarily would, but I will still make a concerted effort to say something beyond token statements of it's good or it's bad. There are 21 of these that I need to get through. Most of them don't last more than about 25 minutes, which naturally limits the scope of discussion, and some of them I can also only watch English dub because the Japanese versions I either cannot find, or they don't provide English subtitles, including the soundtracks. For those of you who care about the whole subbed versus dubbed debate, we can at least come together with the understanding that bad media transcends language barriers. But anyway, I'm going to stop with the preamble and get started. Pray for me, everyone. Pray for me. The Cherry Tree is about a boy named Taichi with a dead dad thanks to World War II, who befriends an old man and tends to a tree. There's an attempt at the linkage between humanity and nature by the old man imparting some wisdom about how trees feel the cold just like people do, and that it becomes particularly pronounced as you get even older. As Taichi spends more time with him, it's clear that the old man is like a surrogate father figure, feeding Taichi and trying to teach him some life lessons along the way. He's thankfully not a creepy old guy, and hey, he has 2 dead sons too. There is an unusual moment, though, when Taichi brings up the picture of his dad when his mom returns from work. He comments on how the old man reminds him of his dad, which is perfectly fine, but then the mom points out that Taichi never actually knew his father. When prompted, she proceeds to tell the story of how they fell in love, and for some reason, Taichi feels the need to explain to the audience that this is the same story that he's heard for several years now. I know that everyone's marital circumstances are different, and especially if World War II was happening, I can understand some people getting military married, but it seems a little odd that the mom doesn't have any other particular stories to tell about Taichi's dad. I mean, she's obviously not going to tell the story of when they banged on the honeymoon or when Taichi was conceived, assuming those are two separate times, but you can't talk about anything else? But apparently, she's not afraid of getting vivid about the cherry tree itself, as the anime then decides to go into a full flashback reminiscence about an air raid firebombing and how the tree somehow survived it. It's probably the best moment of the whole movie since it kind of comes out of left field aesthetically, and because no children's movie is complete without imagery of things burning. But the flashback, the old man, and the cherry tree take the general idea that things that have endured great hardships are able to bloom once they pass through the winter of life. One thing that's going to be very apparent in this video is that so many of these movies involve triumphing over struggles of some sort, and the way in which some of these translate is going to vary wildly in terms of their quality, so buckle up for that, I guess. As far as how it works for the cherry tree, all in all, it's a perfectly okay movie, but it's not exactly gripping either. Still though, you gotta give it to this kid that he runs through harsh weather conditions like he's Rocky Balboa so that he can see the tree bloom. The Boy in the Blue Sea has the absolutely shocking twist of involving non-Japanese human characters. It tells the story of two children, a Polynesian child named Adele and a Japanese boy named Hiroshi. Their friendship endures all kinds of trials, such as not knowing what a ship looks like, falling off a coconut tree, and fish killing. But the ultimate trial comes when Adele learns that his own grandfather was killed in the battle with the Japanese, again shown in some rather vivid detail, and his own angry resentment towards that might complicate things when Hiroshi's life is put in danger. There are two things that I do have to raise an eyebrow at. One is the idea that Hiroshi's dad talks about how he wants his children to be raised in a quote-unquote natural environment, and that the island provides that for them. It's the kind of naturalism sentimentality that really rubs me the wrong way, as though somehow getting closer to nature is the magical answer to several of life's problems. It's not stated outright, but I've seen more than my fair share of media that implies this through subtext, and considering this is Ikeda Daisaku we're talking about, I hope you can understand why I'm not exactly sold on it as a storytelling element in this movie. I'm not saying that nature is a thing to be abandoned, used improperly, or treated with flagrant disregard. Hell, Takahata Isao's Pompoko makes a compelling case that nature shouldn't be abandoned in the push towards greater modernization and urbanity, but that it would have been perfectly fine if the dad had to move to the island for work as a diplomat or something. The other issue is the whole matter of how Adele's anger towards the Japanese, and Hiroshi by extension, is resolved. While on the one hand it could be said that children are willing to understand and put their differences aside in regards to bigotry for the sake of friendship, regardless of how it manifests, Adele gets over his feelings relatively quickly. In addition, the movie attempts to say that the Polynesian islanders and the Japanese might have ancestors from the very island that they're on, and no, just no. I know that this is probably not meant to be taken so literally, but there's something that feels so disingenuous about how this is all presented, as though the captain of the ship that rescued Adele and Hiroshi was told about the anger Adele had and then took it upon himself to properly instruct him about history. It's especially poor since there doesn't seem to be any sincere attempt to actually understand Adele's anger by the Japanese characters in the movie. No reconciliation or moment of empathic connection. A particular detail that I do like is that it takes Hiroshi a rather long time to form some kind of relationship with Adele, as even though it's eventually revealed to the audience to be tied to the language barrier, it uses a time lapse well within its short 39-minute runtime to illustrate that what's bothering Hiroshi is not just conventional shyness, though God forbid he has to get up from his what looks like a leopard quilt, or stop hallucinating that he sees his family or friends in the clouds. There's also a nice shot of the turtles laying eggs on the beach, which reminds me of a similar sequence from the aquatope on white sand. I don't know, if I wanted a quick lecture on racism or hatred that could be given to or understood by children, I could just re-listen to Richard Rodgers and Oscar Hammerstein's South Pacific and the song You've Got to Be Carefully Taught. In fact, I'll just link it in the video's description. Isn't that nice? Okay, so this is the first one that I can honestly say I really don't like. The Princess and the Moon is about a girl named Sachiko who is super picky about food, which is perfectly fine. Lord knows that I was a super picky eater for anything that was a vegetable growing up, to the point where she starts having energy problems and people actively notice that she's not doing well in gym classes. Then she gets visited by a weird rabbit that takes her to the moon, which is a kingdom of utopic bliss where all the children are super happy. They even make happy faces like this. And everyone has crowns on their head because they're all princes and princesses, have fun, study well, and are just flat out better than Earth children. Anyway, Sachiko uses her time on the moon to make changes in her life. She eats more diversely, works to be friendlier to the class jerk, and has her own attitude turn around as a result, the whole 9 yards. The whole idea of this utopic moon world is shown to be pretty whack when the White Rabbit explains that everyone on the moon is what everyone on Earth truly thinks that they are deep inside, and that as a result, everyone is a prince or princess on the moon. Everyone is special. I'm sure there's a participation trophy joke in there somewhere. Anyway, the main reason why this movie just doesn't work is because of the whole moon world's existence. The idea that Sachiko's entire attitude changes from spending a couple of minutes of runtime minutes there, and that somehow being enough to convince her to change her ways, really doesn't work. The movie tries to supplement it by showing a version of herself and her own family, the real self that they are lying underneath. But since the time spent is so minimal, it doesn't feel like it supports a radical enough shift in Sachiko's dourness or overall attitude. As presented, it feels less like a personal reflection and more akin to a kind of religious prophetic vision. I don't have a problem with the message that there might be things about yourself that need to be changed, but the whole thing feels surprisingly cheap and paltry when presented in this particular context. A part of me low-key wishes that the two Sachikos actually swapped places, kind of like the Prince and the Pauper, but I doubt it would include the meaningful social commentary inherent to that story. The other things that are worth noting? Well, the surreal sequence with Sachiko being haunted by all the things she hates is kind of unintentionally funny, and the song that plays as she travels to the moon with the White Rabbit is too cheesy beyond the point of amusement. Also, in the dubbed version, there's something silly about the song saying, "Be yourself and you'll go far, you're perfect just the way you are," when the entire point of the story is that Sachiko needs to be actively changing her habits and become a better person, precisely because her true self is buried under all those habits. Unless it's saying that the power of change is within all of us and that shouldn't be changed. But I don't think that's exactly what they were going for with this one. It's just a resoundingly unimpressive movie with not much to offer except for the youngest of children. And even then, I doubt I would ever want to show this to any children. The Snow Country Prince is the only one of these movies that's actually the length of a full feature at about 90 minutes. It concerns a brother and sister, Koichi and Yuki, who befriend a swan named Blacknose. After helping Blacknose and the other swans by feeding them and shoveling some snow after a serious storm, Koichi is visited by the titular Snow Prince, who takes him away to the Snow Country by flying on a magic golden bird, which I couldn't write without thinking of the Hirata Toshio movie that would be made 2 years later. Anyway, the snowlands have gotten so bad and all the animals have had to go elsewhere to find food, so the prince asks Koichi to take care of the swans until spring as the Snow Prince checks in on the others. There's also a thread introduced early on that Koichi doesn't like to play outside when it's cold, and that's partially why he's sick all the time. It's to the point where members of his family openly comment on it, and the neighbors do as well, as though his reluctance to play in cold weather is some kind of local gossip. The connection between these two stories is that, despite Koichi's aversion to the cold, he allows the warmth of love for the swans, particularly the orphaned Blacknose, and courage to make Koichi realize that it is he who has the capacity to be the warmth that the other swans need, and that he can brave the cold after all. When read through a particular prism, there's something kind of nice to be found here about how a found family can be formed even from two seemingly incompatible parts. A person who has an aversion to the cold, and an animal that was forced to grow up in cold surroundings, both literally and metaphorically. The fact that Koichi and Yuki both decide to start caring for the swans with no direct input from the adults in their lives also shows their willingness to help those who need it. The fact that Koichi promises the Snow Prince that he will take care of the swans likewise emphasizes the importance of keeping a promise, even if no one necessarily believes Koichi's story about meeting the Snow Prince. While that's nice in theory, and even though the movie's longer runtime actually affords it an advantage of allowing its sense of character and relationships to have more build, it's still one leap too far to suggest that this is a good movie. Part of the reason why is that the movie falls into the same problem that a lot of stories about a human taking care of an animal experience. The human's relationship with the animal takes such center stage that it makes the surrounding attempts to inject drama into the story either limp or not nearly as important, comparatively speaking. There's a moment when Koichi learns that his father is in the hospital after an accident, and Koichi has a surprisingly blank expression on his face, thanks to the character animation being so stiff. Compare this to when he was called a coward for not helping Blacknose when it was being attacked by a dog, and the anime seems to treat one as vastly more significant. Even when the Snow Prince returns to comfort Koichi after the accident, all Koichi can talk to him about is how he failed to protect Blacknose. The movie tries paralleling this with Koichi's father getting well by having the courage to face one's pain as a binding tether, but fact is, the human-to-human drama just falls so flat. There's also something to be said about the Snow Prince. For being the title character in the story and having a regality that would presumably give him more importance in the narrative, it's odd that he's such a non-presence in the movie. The problem lies in the character's positioning as a story element. It's perfectly fine if he's not the main character, since Koichi's growth from the beginning to the end is what the story would most benefit from telling. But since the Snow Prince has to go off to other places to take care of other animals, it feels like he kind of dumps the responsibility on Koichi, and how that serves as an excuse to not be a more prominent fixture. As such, the movie actually misses opportunities to let the Snow Prince show Koichi how to take better care of the animals, or having moments where he can be more directly educational. The Snow Prince is in the movie so little that it's partially why I have to recycle footage for this little section of the video. There's just not that much there. He doesn't even appear in the film's climax when Blacknose is able to fly back home. On the whole, this movie is pretty bad, and runs through so many cliches that I'm more than positive you could probably find a better human and animal movie or book that manages to tell all aspects of its story in a more compelling manner. But this movie isn't atrocious or anything of that nature. There's been worse before this movie, and trust me, there will be plenty of bad after it too. Star Amusement Park is very short at only about 17 minutes, but even apart from that, this is definitely better than some of the previous movies that I've discussed in this video already. This one starts with a teacher demonstrating folding a paper crane, likening it to how satellites are folded and unfolded as they go to space. It's given to a child named Noboru and then is stolen by the main protagonist Takashi, but it turns out that the crane is capable of traveling through space and takes Takashi and 3 other children to a space amusement park. Yes, in my mind, Sonic Colors stole this idea. All the space rides talk about broadening your space hearts or filling you with space kindness. The kids feel like they're one with space, and during this time, Takashi is like, wow, I was a dick and took the crane from Noboru. Then there is a near disaster with Space Hell, which, yes, is real, and they rescue their friend Akiko, and everything is fine and dandy as they return home. From a production standpoint, it's probably the worst one visually speaking, since I imagine it wasn't given nearly as much time for realizing everything. The character designs are notably more cartoonish, the general sense of color is pretty bland, and the compositing is not as coherent. But there are some trippy moments though when we get some jank FX animation, which is always fun to see. In terms of the themes of being kind and working together, the turn between Takashi enjoying himself and feeling regret at taking the crane from Noboru is abrupt, and I have to wonder what the logic is in Takashi taking the crane and then being shown an amusement park in space. I get that the rides are supposed to make the heart warmer, but if that's the impetus for Takashi being aware of how mean he was, that's quite flimsy. The connection between the theft and the resolution of the trip doesn't really hold any meaningful water. But truthfully, I can't bring myself to say that this is that bad since it does the things that anime does better than most other media. Put children in active danger and convince me that Space Hell is a real place that I'll go to if I'm on an amusement park roller coaster and don't hang on tightly enough during the vicious sandstorm section. Other anime have a test of courage, this one has a life or death test passing itself off as a test of courage. This does of course beg a serious question. Is there a Space Amusement Park Advisory Committee that can be sued for negligence? That needs an answer. Also, the idea that Takashi really wants to go back there despite the near-death experience of his friend is kind of delightfully messed up. So while the movie is certainly not good, I do love that it just dives full tilt into its science fiction what the space hell, and then goes, yeah, I'd do it again. Following in the footsteps of Star Amusement Park and invoking Grave of the Fireflies in the spirit of putting children in danger, Shining Fireflies is framed around a group of students in the school Fireflies Club, who lament at the teacher saying that there may not be any fireflies appearing. One of the kids has their mother, Chisato, talk about how fireflies saved her life when she was younger. Thus, the story jumps several decades into the past during the Soviet-Japanese War of 1945, and how Chisato and her family were stuck in Manchuria during the conflict. There's a particular moment when, after the initial attack by the Soviets occurs on a train where Chisato's family is fleeing, it then cuts to shots of numerous people, including children, shot up and murdered. I just look at stuff like this, and as much as I try to remind myself that this is a war that actually happened, and the real-life barbarity was perhaps worse than what's being depicted, and that the movie cuts out any showing of blood or particular viscera, this stuff being shown as is in this movie that's intended for children makes me shake my head. It doesn't help that Chisato's mother responds with a kind of attitude that reads like it's downplaying what's happening. We're talking about train cars full of shot and dead bodies, now orphaned children crying their hearts out, and all she can really say is, this is just what war is like. It is a case of the moment itself feeling excessive and the eventual response and reaction being unintentionally dismissive by not conveying the full weight of it all. That said, I do in theory like how the Fireflies come into play with Chisato following them, and finding herself in some kind of mystical space where, away from the cold reality and torment of the war and the troubles that her family faces, she can just be a child and bask in the lights and the sensation. Then the movie has to shoot itself in the foot by having a giant ethereal voice talk about how it's the spirit of the forest and that it's an important ground where hearts gather together, and it's thanks to the fireflies that Chisato was found, and that inspired the kid to find the fireflies with his own gentle heart. I guess you could say that the movie wants to make a case about how bad the Soviet-Japanese War was, but by holding its punches in certain places and focusing so much on being gentle as its moral center, the story and the connection between the past and the present don't align well. It feels too toothless for being a story where death and hardship is a constant fixture, and while being gentle is a noble aspiration, it doesn't work for this story. I'm sorry, I still am just thinking about those shots of the dead children on the train cars. Rainbow Across the Pacific Ocean introduces us to a Chinese immigrant girl named Gyokuren, herself being introduced to her new Japanese class and their classroom floor completely devoid of any texture. Seriously, look at this floor, not a single tile or pattern to be found. After some brazen displays of bullying that the teacher doesn't bother to criticize, including one that happens directly in front of her, Mitsuko uses an American-made doll she finds in her house named Emily, along with the Ark of the Covenant and a fairy hiding within it, to bond with Gyokuren. Oh, and the doll talks, so we're basically only a couple of details away from being the Living Doll episode from The Twilight Zone.
My name is Taki Dina, and you'll be sorry.
So, the movie obviously uses Emily as a means of showing that little tokens of listening and generosity are one of the ways in which we can bridge the gap between people and cultures, and like several of the other movies in the course of this series, it does follow a particular historical framework. As a glossing over, because this is kind of cool, in the course of the 1920s, a doll exchange program was orchestrated between Japan and the United States in order to try to foster warmer relations, since various American legislation and anti-Japanese sentiment created notable frictions. Since the Committee on World Friendship Among Children believed that peaceful futures rested in the hearts of children, it believed that exchanging dolls would be a means to achieve this, since it would be a form of cultural reaching. I don't know why it's showing this by using a weird dance like the kids are gonna ritualistically sacrifice something for the doll, but it's fine. This echoes what's said in the movie's opening scene on a lighthouse balcony about how it would be easy to let other countries come to Japan if they would throw light and rainbow bridges over the Pacific Ocean. In time, more than 10,000 dolls were created, though obviously World War II and time have led to many of them being lost or destroyed. As for how the movie itself is, so right off the bat, I do have to give the movie some sincere props for highlighting a rather fascinating and undersung historical event to support its theming. So many of the movies in this series dealt with peacefully coexisting with others, but since this one has a strong example backing it up, it doesn't feel nearly so hollow or insincere as it might have otherwise. Or at least it would, had it not been so much about Emily that Gyokuren feels like an afterthought. Even though some attempts are made to show Gyokuren's struggle at the new school, the film is front-loaded with expositing about or drama centered around Emily and dolls in general, including a bizarre scene involving Emily getting bound to a stake and charged during World War II. Plus, relying on magic to help make the story work just isn't nearly as effective, since it's through magic that Mitsuko realizes that one of the classroom bullies, named Kanta, is a bully because he doesn't have a mom and he was lonely. It lacks any revelatory power because the doll fairy just tells Mitsuko that that's the case. There's nothing for Mitsuko to discover organically through this approach, and the doll fairy's blunt message about choosing the courageous path of being kind rather than the cowardly path of being cruel doesn't fit as cleanly as the movie thinks it does. This wouldn't necessarily have fixed it, but I do think to highlight the connection between cultures, it would have had at least a little more meaning if the history of the doll exchange came from an American that Mitsuko's family knew or something. To put it another way, less history of the doll and more history of the people the dolls impacted. And the doll-centric focus also makes the climax not work well either. It's shown that both Mitsuko and Gyokuren bring dolls to the class's show and tell, and that Kenta saves the day by rescuing Gyokuren's bow in a tree because it's a symbol of how much she loves her doll. While I'm aware that this is a children's movie that lasts under a half hour, I find myself scratching my head at how all this functions as presented. The historical background is both the movie's strength and its weakness, and at the end of the day, it places so much emphasis on Emily that I don't think it treated Gyokuren nearly so well, even despite her change in happiness and attitude at the end. I mean, we had classmates scrawling hateful messages on the blackboard to an entire class-wide effort to get a bow out of a tree. Though I have to admit, it would have been cosmically funny on some level if it's revealed that the Emily doll has a made in China stamp on her porcelain body somewhere. But of course, that didn't happen. Kanta and the Deer is about a boy named Kanta that meets a deer. Okay, maybe I should make it a little more than that. The deer is named Poyu by Kanta, and after asking his grandfather if they can keep him, and the grandfather being totally okay with this, it turns out that Poyu has a golden tail. Unfortunately, the golden tail makes Poyu a rather tempting target for hunters who want to kill him. Kanta thus spends the movie desiring to keep Poyu alive, as Poyu leaps to the rescue of other deer and glows yellow as though he were a Super Saiyan, and it eventually talks to Kanta as well. The funny thing is that this is the kind of stuff that I was hoping to see with this movie series. Unlike with Shining Fireflies, where the omniscient voice of the forest was introduced at the last minute, Poyu's golden tail and telepathic voice were introduced relatively early, so the switch between surreality and reality is not nearly as jarring or poorly implemented as it was before. Plus, the movie also does give us something that anime has desperately needed: deer moving in sync as a waltz plays on the soundtrack when Kanta and his relative Yuki visit the land of the deer, and then witness what the movie essentially describes as deer sumo wrestling, that Kanta happens to get in on himself. Along with this surprisingly well-animated sequence of the deer running towards the end with Poyu acting like Moses, low-key kind of makes this movie my jam, even with the phoned-in never give up and be gentle to nature thread that's running through a lot of these movies. I do have to take a quick minute to mention separately that I do like the backgrounds in this movie particularly. While they're not exactly museum-worthy or anything of the sort, there's a concerted effort to put a lot of detail and sincerity in their artwork, and it does a lot of the movie's heavy lifting for conveying its pastoral tone. As it turns out, the art director for this was Kubota Tadao, whose work in anime dates back to doing background art for the Dazaki Osamu adaptation of Ashita no Joe, and served as the art director for various anime like Rintaro's film version of Galaxy Express 39 and the first 18 episodes of The Rose of Versailles. The other credited art director, Mukuo Takamura, worked as art director or designer for various installments of Captain Harlock. It goes to show that the anime staff list rabbit hole is something extraordinary. So, while this movie may not exactly be special, and I don't think I could truthfully call it good, it is not that bad. Maybe another one of these will help. You know what I just said? Yeah, strike that. Journey to Hiroshima concerns a journey to Hiroshima. Okay, maybe I should make it a little more than that too. More specifically, it's about a boy named Kazuki who goes to stay with his aunt Yaeko, and listens to her talk about the horrible travails of what happened the day the atomic bomb dropped. Part of what's also hanging over his head is that his friend, Nakamura Hide, had his father's company go bankrupt, and ever since then has seemingly lost all desire to associate with anybody or anything, which I'll get to in a minute. After learning about Hiroshima from Yaeko and her own life story, Kazuki tells Hide about the perseverance of the human spirit, and then he gets good at ping pong again. The movie takes the idea of a journey to Hiroshima a little too literally. Not just in the sense that the bulk of the story takes place there, but rather that Yaeko spends a lot of time with Kazuki, showing him around, talking about how stuff was rebuilt, or showing what stuff was like after the bomb hit. Even though the idea is supposed to be about perseverance and that anything can be overcome through hard work or effort, this whole movie reads like a walking advertisement from the Japanese Ministry of Land, Infrastructure, Transport, and Tourism. The intent is obviously to tie the horrible traumas of Yaeko to those of Hide, using the same kind of flashback framing that Shining Fireflies did. But that being said, I can't help but feel like there is some serious misbalancing going on here. I mean, we're talking about someone who had to endure the fallout and uncertain future of a nuclear bombing aftermath, where both social and personal morale were at a level of devastation that's almost unfathomable. Hide's dad lost his company, and Hide himself lost his own compulsion to play ping pong, which, while without a doubt a tragedy in several ways, both personal and financial, doesn't hit with the same kind of gravitas that the movie is attempting. As a result, the movie needs to up the stakes, so it kind of positions Hide as someone who tried unaliving himself by falling from a high place, complete with a note left to Kazuki essentially saying that he can't go through life anymore. Because Hide winning the ping pong tournament and show the triumph of his spirit through achievement and survival is connected with this emphasis on nuclear tragedy and wanting a world with no more war or nuclear weapons, it's wildly out of left field and leaves the movie as a whole quite ununified. This is what happens when you write a movie that's so unabashedly endowed with political philosophy and incorporate it badly. Oh, and we never find out what happened to Hide's dad after his company went bankrupt. The misbalancing between tragedy of the past and the present reality is a thing shared between this and Rainbow Across the Pacific Ocean, but it's not nearly as bad there since the horror of the past is filtered through the history of what happened to a porcelain doll, rather than paralleling the angle of profound human suffering on a national spiritual level. On the production front, there's two things that I find interesting. One is that we are shown some pretty violent or gruesome imagery, so if you might be squeamish about those sorts of things, keep that in mind. And also, I don't know why, but the English dub for this movie that I watched has really, really bad sound mixing for its dialogue at times. Like, there's a weird warping sound when the characters are talking in the Hiroshima Peace Memorial Museum and other moments, as though they didn't mix out the background music properly. And when they stop talking, the warping sound also stops. It's so distracting. Take a listen.
Where's Aunt Yaeko?
Huh? Oh, she got dizzy and went outside to get some fresh air.
So, yeah, not a fan of this one. I already talked about two Hiroshima anime on this channel in a separate video, and they're both vastly better than this one for completely different reasons, so I'll just link it in the video's description so you can watch that if you want to know why that's the case. Based on Ikeda's book of the same name that I mentioned at the start of this video, the human revolution is... Okay, so time for a disclaimer, everyone. This series is virtually impossible to talk about at analytical length, as most sites that I know of that carry it only have a few episodes available with English subtitles. While a friend of mine was able to get me all 20 episodes of it, none of those had English subtitles, which means that as I sat down to watch this series, I was essentially flying into it about 75% blind, and considering that it's supposed to be an account of one of the earliest influential figures in Soka Gakkai's history, Toda Josei, I can't really speak to the accuracy of what's being depicted in the show insofar as what I can glean in the first place. So keep in mind that my commentary for this one is going to be very odd. So let's try to start somewhere first. Obviously, much of the series revolves around Toda, and especially early on, it consists of him sitting in a small room talking about his particular Buddhist philosophy to a bunch of eager listeners, including Yamamoto Shinichi, a character who comes to the lectures and then decides to devote pretty much everything to Toda and his teaching. From there, it's essentially a giant chronicling of Toda and Soka Gakkai as a religious and political entity, some of the things that they did, and with one discussion after another related to Toda's perspective on righteous living and what his followers must do. In case the description I provided and my tone of voice didn't really give it away, I don't exactly have anything positive to say about this series. As funny as it is that the director of the original Cutie Honey adaptation and UFO Robo Grendizer worked on this as director, so much of this series is incredibly dull, plodding, and pedantic. It assumes that Toda's philosophical majesty and his resulting influence over others like Yamamoto is something that can alone carry it through all its close-ups or events, helped by the narrator. Needless to say, it does not succeed at this at all. It assumes on some fundamental level that you already have a vested interest in the history of Soka Gakkai or Toda, so it opts for the laziest means of trying to communicate its chronicle or its people. It reads as reminiscent of those kinds of historical documentaries that your teacher puts on when they don't want to teach anymore, in that it doesn't inspire the imagination or spurn curiosity on the part of the viewer. If anything, the doggedness of it all sucks away rather than leaves behind, unless it's leaving behind an abyss. But one thing did interest me as I was watching, and I found myself struck by a particular thought. It's possible that maybe the original source could provide some insight that the anime can't. Because, yes, I did in fact read the first volume of the English-translated The Human Revolution in order to get a little more context surrounding trying to understand this anime. Like most screeds that purport to be about one person and their phenomenal struggle, Ikeda's writing makes it seem like everything in Japan was an abject hell except for Toda's words and life. I certainly don't doubt that post-World War II Japan was a horrible reality, as I hope I made clear in talking about Journey to Hiroshima, for instance, but so much time is spent propping up Toda against Japan's state of affairs that, even if some of the extremely numerous, hyper-specific details of the book are in fact true, it doesn't necessarily paint the most flattering picture of him either. To highlight this, I was particularly struck by one of the last lectures of the book, which was adapted into the anime. Yamamoto asks what it means to lead a righteous life. On page 214 of the book, Toda says that he is one of the very few people with conviction to provide such an answer, and talks about how he studied the Nichiren Daishonin. Contrast what I just said with what the anime talks about at the end of the second episode. Same general conversation, same characters. Toda himself, at least from what the subtitles claim, says that no philosophy or person could possibly account for the ultimate question concerning leading a righteous life. All he can do is answer for himself. While he still claims that Nichiren Daishonin gives the answers to life's problems, we see a kind of split between the supposed receptivity of showing humbly that no one has the answer and proposing the solution as Toda sees it, versus an attitude of how he is uniquely equipped to talk about everything. Now, I'm absolutely sure that someone could reasonably criticize my excerpt selections here, or point out that there are several volumes of The Human Revolution and I only saw a small piece of the larger puzzle, or that I don't have the fuller context. But to that I say, if Ikeda or the anime adaptation wanted me to invest more time in learning about this stuff, they should have done a better job of actually positioning themselves as things worth listening to. I already willingly read the original The Human Revolution volume when I didn't have to, and both book and anime suffer from the same problem that a lot of bad biographies or documentaries do. To quote movie critic Ignaty Vishnevetsky when criticizing the documentary Forks Over Knives,
"It's got a topic and no documentary."
Both experiences of trying to understand this story, including fighting my way through the language barrier and being reasonable to give benefit of the doubt with regards to potential cultural gaps, and reading over 200 pages of the original source material, does not account for the absolute drag that both provided. Hearing statement after statement or character after character constantly talk about how great or wise Toda was became a rhetorical strategy that got very old very quickly, even if there was truthfulness to the stories of the people that were being told here. Listen, I don't want to be misunderstood. I'm not knocking religion as a means of orienting oneself in life, and particularly in regards to answering big questions about who we are or why we're here or anything of that nature, nor the idea of figures past and present who preach. In the same way, I'm not knocking atheism or agnosticism or irreligiosity. Whatever you believe, as long as you're not acting like a prick, I don't care. But I am saying that, as pieces that are supposedly providing insight into those very questions that they seek to answer through the exploration of Toda Josei, I found nothing within the human revolution that had not been seen or delivered more eloquently or interestingly elsewhere. It was a chloroform-laden mess as a reading of history or biography, factual or otherwise. It was unengaging as a visual acoustic exercise, and it was perhaps the least amount of fun that I have had watching or reading something in a very long time. No, thank you. Okay, just to broadcast early on, this is easily the best of all the movies that I watched during the course of making this video. The Two Princes takes place in the fictitious Kingdom of Jambe, where Prince Rupiah is given the crown of a nameless king on his 7th birthday, while the shy Subarna is shown to be the lead of a village play where he will play a prince. To help Subarna overcome his own reluctance and shyness, an old man gives Subarna his own crown, which glows as Subarna does a kind act. When Rupiah hears of Subarna's actions and how the people are proclaiming him as the king instead, it'll lead to revelations for all involved, and their fates become intertwined. And having the Rupiah and Subarna character stories run parallel, it illustrates the story's larger point that those who criticize or castigate those they perceive as lesser or lower than them are the true inferior ones, and that those with nobility and kindness will rise above all others. By having Subarna overcome his own shyness to perform good deeds, he earns the respect of both himself and the others whose lives he positively helps through caring for them and bringing smiles and joys to the people. This is particularly the reason why, upon being given his crown, Rupiah assumes that he'll be a respected king like the kings of the past, but his advisors don't reply. Rupiah mistakenly believes that being in a position of power means that he has respect given to him rather than having respect earned. As such, when Rupiah and Subarna's confrontation takes place and the crowd unapologetically proclaims Subarna as a noble child and their supposed real king, it feels earned both as an event in story and as part of the larger overarching theme. As such, the kindness within Subarna reverberates into Rupiah's own thinking, bonding them. And wisely, the story decides to let the relationship between the two actually continue beyond that. By jumping ahead to when both Rupiah and Subarna have helped the kingdom to prosper, the movie introduces a final conflict that provides Subarna with one last noble sacrifice, which impacts everyone in the story. I have to admit that I genuinely did not see this coming, and it does preach the important message that even if a good person happens to leave our lives, it doesn't change the fact that their presence and everything they did will be remembered fondly. I actually like this one. I like this one? Is that even allowed? The Winds of Victory, or A Breeze Across the Field, follows a newcomer student to a school named Kenji, who really wants to join his school's really wants to join his school's football team. His desperation to be the best gets the team's captain, Yuta, injured after a tackle attempt, and the team has to try and get their spirits back up for their upcoming matches. All the while, Kenji runs on a short fuse and tries to understand Yuta's actions as still helping the team, even though he can't play for a couple of months. Right off the bat, the movie decides not to use any fantasy or fantastical elements, planting itself rather firmly in the real world and in a scenario that's common enough for anyone to understand. Without any talking fairies, talking deer, or anything of that nature, it allows things to maintain a solid footing as it can remain a more tightly focused character piece instead. Kenji's personality is believable as constructed, and his upset and temperament getting the best of him, causing problems and ultimately leading to his revelation at the end is more solidly planned and executed on most fronts compared to many of the other movies that I've discussed here. Obviously, with only about 30 minutes to get its story told, it can't quite commit as well as it might have otherwise, but its message is in the right place, and it doesn't really give any unintended readings that might undermine its own thematic base. Though it might get a little miry as the coach talks about doing your personal best a lot, even though being on a team is a central aspect of the movie. The movie also does try to inject some history into itself by throwing in the plot about the British sister school agreeing to have some students come to Japan, having some knowledge about the British commander Wellington, including the apocryphal story about how he supposedly said that the Battle of Waterloo was fought on the fields of Eton. This whole discussion, along with the memorial of British and German students who died during World War II, tries tying into the sports element by reflecting that it's better not to see the opposing team as a thing to resent, though how well it does this leaves a bit to be desired. But yeah, that's 2 decent movies in a row. What is happening? Okay, so full disclosure, I really don't know how I'm going to talk about Our Peace River. There's no version of it that I could find anywhere that offered subtitles. The one link that I tried using would not work properly, and so I'm going to have to rely on what I think is a Croatian dub of this movie that someone generously uploaded. So a special thank you to, and I am so sorry if I am butchering this name, YouTube user Božidar Božo for this. I'll put a link in the video's description. So with both the linguistic and video quality barrier happening here, all I can do is say that this is essentially an adventure story with a colorful cast of characters, although there's one moment where a character does have what looks like a Führer mustache, and there's certainly a stereotypical reading that could be taken with what appears to be the wise old black man character archetype, like Uncle Remus from Disney's Song of the South, and a character wearing what passes for a cheap 90s racist Native American costume. I'm going to assume that it's just a little movie about friendship and working together regardless of what background you have so that you can overcome hardships as it relates to someone or something that they know, and call it at that. The Himalayan Kingdom of Light begins with a father and son climbing a mountain and the dad starts singing. So I got excited for a minute thinking that this was going to be an animated musical, and it kind of is? Does 2.5 songs in a 25-minute anime movie make a musical? Anyway, the actual story is about a boy from Nepal named Surya who finds a note attached to a crane and hears an omnipresent voice that tells him to follow the path of the birds, while the note says the ever so helpful message, help. Surya embarks on a journey to find the letter's writer, taking a cue from his mom's advice, and wisely decides to leave his parents in the middle of the night with no way of knowing where to go or what to do. He goes inside a magic ball and is whisked away to the titular Kingdom of Light and realizes it's a shithole where everything is dark and everyone is miserable. By befriending a boy named Chandra, Surya hopes to bring the light back to the kingdom by finding out what exactly is causing this melancholic overhang. Compared to a couple of the other movies on this list, the Himalayan Kingdom of Light actually manages to connect its themes of sadness and being able to move on a little more effectively, by drawing a distinction between actual sorrowful grieving and the illusion of sorrow through imitating or enforcing a symbol of sorrow, in this case, the golden braces on their necks. It also draws a simple enough visual parallel between the weather of the town and the mood of its population such that, while nothing special, at least shows that it's choosing to go for simplicity rather than having something that might lead to unintentional readings as a consequence. There's also a rather, unintentionally funny moment where the former king of the Kingdom of Light collapses while addressing a crowd of what looks like 20 people, and once Surya makes the connection that the princess of the kingdom is actually okay, everyone gets really mad and starts to rebel against the minister who lied to them, which nearly gets Surya killed by an assassin. So perhaps a more charitable reading of this material is that Surya instigates a violent political revolution against the tyrannical government. It's at the very least more involved than what the two princes did, and that's pretty radical. One thing that does suck is the animation. Especially since there is more than one musical number in the course of the movie, you would think that it would be a prime opportunity to let the animators flex their creative muscles, but sadly, that just doesn't happen. They're static and completely unmoving, leaving everything to be carried by the insanely cheesy songs that sound like they were the rejects from children's sing-along tapes. But my gripes aside, this one is actually not that bad. I mean, it's not good, but considering that I still have 7 of these to go, this one seems nice. Oh god, I still have 7 of these to go. The Prince and the Coral Sea is actually a movie that I watched about 2 years ago while using the random function on a totally legal anime site, and needless to say, I was not looking forward to rewatching this one. But hey, rewatching things brings new perspectives, doesn't it? And having seen it again for the purposes of this video, I can say that I still do not like this one. It follows a story on Okinawa, where a mermaid saves a boy named Ray from drowning after he feels sympathy for some coral, and she mentions that silt is hurting the reef and the waters. Ray's sister Mia is sick, there are some samurai assholes, Ray starts using the shell that the mermaid left behind, which came from a big star, to start trading his life away for his younger sister's health, and also ends up helping other people. It then turns out that Ray finds his dad after healing his sister's eyes, which proves that Ray is the prince of the whole land, and then he sacrifices himself to stop a giant tidal wave and restores the island like a reverse Götterdämmerung. Ugh, for the love of God. The main thing about this one that really gets me is that while the previous movies all have a general problem of feeling like they are sometimes lumbering along, this one seems to drag more than the others. It's so overstuffed with characters and moments that don't weave together well, so every time a single new thing is added, I started involuntarily doing the hurry up motion with my hand. This isn't even getting into the fact that, despite being prominently featured in the movie's poster, the mermaid does not come back in the latter half since she exists purely as a device to get the plot moving and to provide exposition about the shell and how great it is that only good-hearted people can use its power. It's so front-loaded with so much stuff that the innards don't provide anything particularly insightful or dramaturgically intriguing. The story obviously wants to follow a self-sacrifice narrative, that it is worth going particularly out of your way in order to help others, even if it results in you injuring yourself in the process. And look, I'm not trying to dunk on self-sacrifice for the good of others as a personal guiding philosophy, religiously inclined or otherwise. Doing things because you care is noble, but we are in fact watching a child essentially sacrifice his entire existence and state of being for the sake of everyone else. The fact that Ray is the only one who actively seems to be doing anything about the unfortunate circumstances that are dictating the state of affairs makes everyone else seem either unwilling to do anything or not particularly helpful in assisting Ray achieve those ends. So even though the movie ends with Ray's dad saying that he'll build a kingdom with good-hearted people, it's kind of late for that for the son you used to have, buddy. But hey, at least Ray comes back in the form of star-shaped grains of sand, right? Jeez, let's move on. The Prince and the White Horse is yet another War is Bad movie which involves yet another magical creature doing yet another magical thing. A boy named Batar is about to take part in a horse race, and he decides to ponder why adults fight wars since a war hurt his dad so that he could never ride again, and killed his friend Sue's dad. After learning about the legendary Prince on the White Horse who brought peace to the red and blue tribes, he meets a white horse named Toya who starts talking to him, traveling back in time to 10 years ago when the war between the red and blue tribes was about to take place in an effort to stop it from happening, so they have a horse race instead. A bewildering aspect of the story comes pretty early on when one of the characters that Batar is talking to exposits about the history of the Prince on the White Horse. He talks about how one day the Prince will return and teach everyone once again about courage, and the implication is that the Prince's return would likewise end the warfare between the nations. This whole framing just reeks of insincerity and as a giant excuse for why nothing has been done concerning the overarching problem. The character is essentially shirking all the responsibility for peaceful coexistence not on himself and everyone else who desires a more peaceful life, but rather on a prince who may or may not even return to the land. Considering that he goes out of his way to explain that the Prince on the White Horse is a legend that he and his people will never forget, they apparently do a pretty horrible job of living up to the honor of that legend. Assuming that the time manipulation had not happened, I imagine that everyone would have been perfectly content to do nothing about what was transpiring. Also, there's this crazy realization that Toya the horse is apparently not capable of taking Batar somewhere that can heal his father, or that Toyo with all his power could heal him himself, but does apparently have the ability to travel through time? I know that I'm applying something resembling logic to a movie that's clearly intended to be a morality play, but this is what happens when you find a movie so uninteresting. But since I'm already here, there's also the question of just how the timeline butterfly effect works. When Baatar returns to the present, everyone is waiting for him to return because apparently they all know that he was the prince on the white horse of legend. But if that's the case, was there a previous prince on the white horse to create the initial legend for the story about bringing the two tribes together before Baatar's time jump happened? And did that prince do such a bad job of creating peace that it was short-lived and the tribes ended up fighting soon afterwards? And because the time jump only goes back 10 years, did everyone in both tribes do such a bad job of remembering the prince's noble efforts? Was it just some legend that someone made up and it didn't work? Did the legend only initially apply to the blue tribe and how quote-unquote unforgettable it was? And if so, did the red tribe have their own equivalent? Other things worth highlighting, or lowlighting I guess I should say. First, much like the Himalayan Kingdom of Light, this is another movie that tries having a musical number, and if I had to describe Kim Strauss's singing as anything, it comes across like a not nearly as rousing or spirited Brian Stokes Mitchell, as though it's trying too hard to channel the Prince of Egypt. But musically, it's so bland and lacks any discernible flavor to assist it. Take a quick listen.
Can never see its purpose in the pattern of the grand design. When a brave prince appeared and made peace with his foes.
I also need to take a quick minute to say that this movie also looks pretty bad. In the first scene, when Baatar and Sue are talking on the hill, the compositing is so terrible that it looks like both the characters and the sheep aren't even standing on anything resembling grass, as if they're occupying a foreground and background layer that are somehow different than the layers that are supposedly being shown on screen. And it's also not well voice acted either. Wendy Lee and David Lelyveld really did a poor job of depicting the two leads, which makes the whole movie likewise reek of staleness and a thematic exercise that has itself already become incredibly stale. Even among the movies that have been featured in this video, The Prince and the White Horse is quite down there on the ladder. Easily one of the worst of the bunch. Send it to the glue factory. The Princess of the Desert Kingdom takes place in a desert kingdom. Amazing, I know, in which the water and vegetation have essentially died off. With the rumor of an oasis spring hidden somewhere out in the wilderness, the rulers of the kingdom decide to investigate it. Why they didn't do that sooner is beyond me. And of course, with the kingdom facing such an unprecedented crisis that could wipe them out forever, the young princess suggests that only she should go and search for the oasis. And so, with her animal friends to help her out, a lone child sets out into the desert heat with no way of knowing where to go searching. It's actually surprisingly difficult to talk about this one at any length because the main descriptor that comes to mind for me with this movie is just boring. So much of the first half of the movie is the princess and her animal friends walking through the desert, complaining about the heat, and having rather asinine moments like when the monkey and the parrot have a brief scuffle that leads to one of the water bags breaking and falling off the camel. Though this does make clear that the princess can converse with the animals, so that's kind of nice. But given the rather already uninteresting aesthetic that the series has with its sand dunes and coloring book-style rooms at the palace, there isn't much here either dramaturgically or visually to cling to. A near attack from some other animals only provides a slight boost to the intrigue, but it fades away just as quickly as it appears. It also doesn't help that the first minute or so of the English dub for this has perhaps the worst first minute out of everything that I had talked about up to this point. So in terms of its first half, this movie stumbles pretty badly.
Where people and animals live together in harmony with nature.
And the second half doesn't fare any better since once the oasis is found, there's basically no more danger involved. Even though the princess is summoned back to the kingdom because the situation is getting worse, all the animals of the oasis contribute to the relief effort by ferrying the water back. And to the shock of absolutely no one who has been watching this video all the way through to this point, it contains an environmental message about how if we all work together and be respectful of the earth and the animals, we can thrive. But more than most, this movie is also trying so hard to be funny with these animal characters as though it has to try and inject some levity into the situation by giving them either ostensibly funny voices or doing things that are ostensibly comedic. This feels strange because so many of the previous movies had their own stories with varying degrees of danger, but those rarely opted to artificially infuse them with comedy. Perhaps the reasoning behind this was because the situation is talking about the end of an entire kingdom, there needs to to be some kind of counterbalance to that. It's one of those cases where it might make sense in theory, but actually incorporating it into practice shows that sometimes it's better to just leave well enough alone. If I had to compare watching this movie to anything, it was like sitting through one of those elementary school assemblies where some kid-friendly group with colorful shirts comes in to talk about some life lesson. It isn't exactly long, but it feels like an eternity. From one desert to another, it seems. The Treasures of the Desert is about Yuta, who says in class one day that he wants to go exploring because he thinks that Japan is too small. After pointing to Dunhuang, China, and being shown a picture of Dunhuang by his teacher later that day, this happens. And he gets pulled into the picture and travels along the desert. Yuta eventually comes across Dunhuang and hears of the treasures that lie in the Magao caves told by an old man, and so he quests to find them, not knowing that the treasures that might be lying in wait are worth far more than any gems or gold. As much as I might love a treasure hunting story as much as the next person, and even then it's pretty debatable whether you could call it that based on how things progress plot-wise in this movie, The Treasures of the Desert manages to capsize Yuta's character introduction early on by him receiving a portrait drawing from a classmate for his birthday, and then the moment ends with Yuta saying out loud that he wishes he was given something else. Someone put some serious time and effort into drawing this, and that's the remark that you're going to give them? I know that kids are sometimes not the most aware or considerate, or may say some things that they're thinking without taking a moment to filter it properly, but it takes a certain amount of gall to say that you wish someone had given you a different gift altogether. Obviously, you're not supposed to find Yuta's behavior condonable or commendable, but if you're trying to show your character as being at least a little bit likable at the start, you've certainly gotten off on the wrong foot. But as shocking as that might be, he's not even the worst character in the movie, since he at least undergoes some kind of growth along the way, as phoned in as it comes across. No, that honor goes to the gold and silver camels that accompany Yuta along his journey. More or less this movie's version of Rut and Took, the two moose from Disney's Brother Bear. They are by far the most unnecessarily creepy thing that I have seen in a good long while that wasn't intended to be something horrible. Aside from the fact that their voice acting and directing is pretty horrid, I'm sorry Ron Allen and David Lelyveld, they also do this annoying heh several times throughout the movie, and every time that they do, it makes me feel like they're about to murder someone when they're not looking. And if you think I'm exaggerating, just have a listen. One thing that I can at least appreciate in the abstract is that the movie does make an effort to show that the Magao cave paintings may not necessarily be something that invokes the same sense of possession like a game console or a toy. As the old man uses the murals to convey the importance of cultural history and preservation, it likewise carries into the general lesson that things created with care from the heart carry a weight that other things don't. Granted, it doesn't really help the movie's case of being a slog the entire way, more so than most of the movies I've been featuring here, even though it may include some tidbits about Chinese geography. This just easily ranks as one of the worst movies of the lot, and considering how bad a lot of them are, that's saying something. If I've learned anything from watching all of these, it's that I should stay far away from deserts. Rainbow Mountain is the kind of movie that makes me think I could be spending my time watching Ojamajo Doremi instead with character designs that look like that. But nope, I'm watching this dinky little thing instead. This movie is about 3 kids who want to journey to the mountaintop because that's supposedly where the first rainbow was created. As they venture up the mountain and come across various obstacles like wind and slim paths, they also bump into a fairy that tells them not to use violence against the threats they encounter on the mountain, and instead use their magical crayons and paper to overcome anything. Now, I could sit here and remark that it's nearly impossible for a bunch of inexperienced elementary or kindergarten students to climb a mountain when they have effectively no sense of survival skills to speak of, but unlike some of the other movies in the series, the stakes for this are relatively low in the grand scheme of things. As a result, the whole believe in yourself thread that runs through the journey feels less like a substitution for a larger metaphysical idea and more the result of a simple children's adventure story. It embodies its colorful and cutesy aesthetic more so than some of the other movies I've seen here, so it has that going for it. The thing that surprises me the most about this movie, though, is that the credited character designer was Onishi Yoichi, and that they've had a very long career in the industry of working on various media like Gintama the Final as an animation director, the Toei adaptation of Canon as a character designer, and key animation for several Dragon Ball movies. If there is anything to be learned from watching a bunch of anime, it's that you never know who will have worked on what and when. The media it produces may not be that great, but anime in general is pretty cool for stuff like this. And this one isn't so bad, so I give it a pass. Alexander's decision, at least on the immediate surface, seems like it would have been written by a different author. Considering how so many of these stories pertain to saying no to war, or how war is a device or portal for reflecting human cowardice, making a story based on one of the greatest military minds in history seems like a left turn. And considering that this movie is about double the length of the others except for the Human Revolution and the Snow Country Prince, it has quite a bit of meat to it. During the course of a military campaign, Macedon King Alexander the Great falls ill with fever. As he tries to calm himself while dealing with a military demand from the enemy, he is visited by his old friend Philip, a Persian, who claims that he can heal Alexander's fever. Caught now within the struggle of either believing his friend and trusting him, or treating Philip as an enemy precisely because he is a Persian, Alexander needs to remember everything that he learned from his teachings with Aristotle, and his memories of being friends with Philip, and make a decision. First of all, I have to give some props to this movie for being willing to tackle so bluntly the idea of racism, and in a better way than The Boy and the Sea did. By utilizing Alexander's past recollections as a source of fueling his ultimate decision concerning Philip, it shows not only that this is not a new abstract problem that he's facing, but that it's one that he's had to wrestle with even among his own people. Philip's status as a Persian in the Macedon Empire causes particular friction with Ptolemy, who believes zealously in the notion that anyone who is from Persia is clearly a spy and untrustworthy. Though the exposition behind Ptolemy's underlying racism is rather clunkily delivered by Aristotle, it does demonstrate that hateful sentiments can arise when one feels that they have been wronged, and how that may be mapped onto an entire citizenry by extension. Part of the reason why this works decently well is because, as structured in the story, it parallels Alexander's father's own assassination. Alexander's anger at the assassination and his fury at wanting to see everyone related to the assassin executed blinds him and his reasoning. This does give a rather unfortunate modernist lens to historical settings, though. Philip insists that the assassin has to be given a fair trial despite the hundreds who witnessed the assassin, even though in the real story of what happened, King Philip II, yes, they share the same name here, which is kind of unfortunate in and of itself, was murdered, and then his assassin was immediately murdered after trying to flee on horseback. The intent is clear behind why the story is taking this dramatic liberty, but it doesn't ring as clearly as it might have otherwise. I know it seems a bit silly to criticize a story for its historical accuracy here, but I guess I take a little umbrage with an approach like this for something that happened hundreds of years ago. There are two other things that can be discussed, though. One is the rather homoerotic subtext going on here. Considering how much emphasis is put on Alexander and Philip's friendship, I can't help but wonder how this story might have looked if they decided to go full tilt into that angle. I mean, it is true that when it comes to stories about male-male friendships, things take on a more entertaining reading if you think of it all as boys' love fiction instead. It certainly adds more spice to Fist of the North Star and its manly men doing manly bonding and manly crying. The visual aesthetic is also something that needs to be talked about. There is more of an emphasis on complex character designs, and especially since the cast of the movie is primarily made of adults rather than children, it does stand out in that respect. But within that presentational flair does come the problem that sometimes the animation is just a little bit goofy or cheap. As two specific examples, there's a great moment where Alexander's great army is marching, except that they aren't actually moving despite supposedly passing through a valley. The camera pan basically has to simulate the movement for them. Then, during the moment when Alexander's father was murdered, the movement and impact of the knife, as well as the crumpling to the floor, looks like they didn't do much filling in between the keyframes. Even though the movie doesn't quite have all its priorities in the right order, as it does oddly sideline Philip in the very end as the narrator talks about Alexander's conquests, it's definitely among the better efforts. The extra time afforded gives more dimension to Alexander and Philip's dynamic, and it's not that bad. And thank goodness, because there's only one of these movies left. The Flower and the Phoenix is actually good? After a class discussion about their mother's favorite flowers, two children named Yuji and Koichi decide to try and get a rare bamboo flower from the forest that'll cheer up Yuji's mother because she's still sad from when her own mother died about a year ago. While they explore, they come across the legendary Phoenix, who asks them to help save the forest and the Fountain of Life from the evil people that have taken over the castle that help safeguard the fountain. Look, I don't make this stuff, I just tell it like it is. Ignoring the fact that the Phoenix being in the story reminds me that I should get back to reading that Tezuka manga, it's certainly among the more entertaining of the movies in this series, though it's certainly not flawless. During the course of the movie, it seems like Koichi more than Yuji is the one who visibly has a vested interest in everything that's going on, being a lot more brash and overtly enthusiastic about meeting the Phoenix and answering its call to save the forest. It definitely comes at the price of Yuji's character, especially considering some of what happens later, but Koichi has got a magnetic presence that I found hard not to like. As far as stuff that's good, there's this one kid in Yuji and Koichi's class who basically harasses everyone that he comes into contact with, and it helps that the English dub gives him that kind of nasally voice that you normally give someone who's supposed to be an absolute brat. It culminates in this moment where Yuji is so fed up with this kid talking shit that he basically tackles him to the ground and cuts his arm, and Yuji seemingly suffers no consequences from this. To put this into perspective, Koichi and Yuji got scolded more by the librarian telling them to be quiet rather than Yuji injuring a classmate. I don't know how the disciplinary system works in this school, but I'd like to think that it ended with Yuji getting an award or something. There's also Koichi's grandmother, who I love for the simple reason that she likes talking to plants more than she likes talking to people. Though this does kind of raise the question of why she spends so much time talking to Koichi and Yuji. By Koichi's own admission, his grandmother doesn't open up nearly so easily, but frankly, from the time that she spends on screen, you'd think that she was perfectly sociable just like anyone else. Maybe Yuji gets a pass because he also likes flowers? I don't know. And then there's these kinds of guys who exude some ridiculous child entertainment friendly thug energy that it's kind of amazing. Some of this dialogue is just amazing too.
You aren't even aware of the fact that the people in your life don't like you.
And they're the ones who hold Yuji responsible for the fight he got in with his classmate. And he somehow abducted Koichi's grandmother? While the overall message concerning keeping the earth clean by taking care of it and being friendly and never giving up and using words to solve your problems has been repeated so many times throughout the course of this whole movie series, this is one time where the overall presentation and performances ultimately have it to be a notable cut above the rest. The movie is quite colorful, and it has several moments of comedy that are at least mildly amusing and that don't feel too out of place. Hearing Koichi and the evil guy barb at each other is way more fun than it should have been. Who would have thought that Ueda Yoshihiro, the man responsible for directing one of the best Dragon Ball Z movies with BoJack Unbound, would have worked on something like this? So there you have it, every single Ikeda Daisaku anime adaptation. What are my thoughts? Don't do this. Talking about why each of these works or does not work was a lot of fun, but actually sitting down and experiencing some of the same general themes repeated so many times in slightly different and occasionally tone-deaf packages was far more of a drain on my soul than I was intending. I guess there's a certain irony in books from a religious figure making me feel empty. But if you want something more constructive, most of these anime can be lumped under 3 categories: bad, mediocre, and actually kind of okay, with the 2 princes and the flower and the phoenix as being the best ones, but for entirely different reasons. If you have to watch any of these, I recommend those 2 in particular. And no, I was not converted to Soka Gakkai. Witty retort, sign off. A special thank you to my patrons, and a thank you for watching. Feel free to like, comment, subscribe, click the bell for notifications so you don't miss an upload, donate to my Patreon, or follow my social media accounts. Links provided in the video's description. In the meantime, this has been ZNote of ZNoteTaku. Happy viewing, everyone!